Hi, my name's Justin Shelf and I'm the engineering lead at PatchMyPC. We develop a third-party patch management solution that integrates into Microsoft Configuration Manager. Prior to my current role, I was also a Premier Field Engineer at Microsoft supporting Config Manager. In this video, we're going to be doing a deep dive into the application deployment process from a client-side perspective. So this is not going to be an overview of creating applications and deployment types. This is going to be a deep dive into what's actually happening on the client side when it gets policy for applications, how the client evaluates the different requirements that you might have for your deployment types, the download process of the content, as well as the installation. So just a deep dive into what it actually looks like on the client side and all of the client components involved in the actual installation of applications. So if you're looking for a basic guide on creating applications, this video would not be the one for you. This is really going to be that deep dive of what's actually happening when we deploy it, how that client's going to actually evaluate and install the application. But for this demo, I do want to show you the application that we will be using in deploying to our client. So it's a 7-zip application, so it's a pretty basic app. So what we've got going on is our application, and we have two different deployment types. So we have the 32-bit MSI and the 64-bit MSI of 7-zip within this application for our deployment types. So if we actually do properties of this, it's pretty basic what we're doing here. So within our content for the 32-bit version, we're just pointing out to the 32-bit MSI file. So that's all that's going on there. For the installation, we're just using our MSI. But for the requirements, since this is the 32-bit version, we're making it so it would only install on client operating systems that are running the 32-bit version of the OS. So that's what we have going on for this deployment type. Now, our second deployment type, that's going to be for our 64-bit version of 7-zip. So everything else is quite similar. The only difference here is that we're using the 64-bit MSI, and for the requirements, we're using the 64-bit version of our client operating systems. Now, I have already deployed this to my device. So the device that we're going to be analyzing, we have this in a collection that device is in. And this is just an available deployment. So we're going to see it in Software Center, and we are showing notifications. So we would get the balloon notification when it's available, and we would see that in the system tray. All right, so jumping over to our client, this is where we're going to be analyzing most of the content within this video for the application installation process and the evaluation. This is all going to be on our client side. So this machine has not got policy yet for this application. So we just powered this machine on, and what we'll do to speed things up is we'll go ahead and start a machine policy cycle. So if we go ahead and look at Policy Agent, what we're going to notice here is this machine is going to start downloading different policies. In our case, it's going to go get the policy for the application, and then things will be happening in the background for the evaluation. And what we're going to do, we'll dig through each of these different components that are involved in this download and this evaluation of the application. So now we can see that since we showed notifications and this is just an available deployment, we did get that notification saying, hey, you have new software available. So at this point, I think that we'll go ahead and close out of this log and we'll minimize that. And then what we'll do, we'll go ahead and open up all our log files on our client because there's a lot of different components involved. And what we'll do, we'll kind of walk through the different process of how we would go through and see what actually is happening. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and open up all my client logs, and then I'm going to choose the merge option within CM Trace so we can kind of walk through and see what specifically is happening here. Now, what we want to do is if I jump back to my console, and if I look at my application and my deployment, what I'm going to do is go ahead and copy the deployment ID, and then what we're going to do is after we go back to our client, so we've merged every single log file. So what we're going to do next here is I'm going to copy that deployment ID, and then we're going to search for that. All right. So if we look at where it found it, we're about halfway through this log file. So most of the information that we've got up here, this is mostly going to be just information about the SMS service when it was starting up. So this is just a lot of data, different log files for when that service was actually starting. But if we come back here and search for that deployment ID, the first thing that's really going to be relevant for us is going to be the policy. So since we've got all these log files merged, this is actually coming from our policy agent log file. So that's the first thing that needs to happen for our client when we get a new application deployment. So it's going to get the policy when it downloads that from our management point. Now, once we verify that policy agent starts seeing that we have the policy, the next thing that's going to happen is our data transfer service is actually going to kick in, and then it's going to start downloading that policy. So let me just do a quick search. That shouldn't be too much further down here. So I'm going to search for the policy ID. So here we go. So now that we've got the policy, data transfer service is going to then actually initiate the download of that policy, and then it's going to start evaluating different things within that. Now, once we download the policy, we're going to store that into WMI. So I'm using WMI Explorer. I'll include a link to this in our resources within the accompanying blog post. So if we go ahead and connect into our machine here, what we're going to want to look at is our CCM namespace. So if we take a look at that, expand that, and then there's going to be a policy, and we want to look at the machine policy. Oh, here we are. And then the actual config. So if we go ahead and open that up, the information about where this application information actually gets stored in WMI is going to be in the class, the CCM application CI assignment. So if we actually look at this class, we're going to notice we have a new instance. Now, if we look at the instance, we can verify that the assignment ID actually matches that deployment ID within Config Manager. So this is going to be where the policy gets compiled, and this is going to be where all the different Config Manager components, a lot of data that they read about different actions, it stores that in WMI, and a lot of that data will get read from WMI. So here we can see just various information about this. So for example, we're going to get the name of the application, we're going to get whether it's available or required, information about whether we're making it visible to the user, and just different information, the deadline, the start time, just data about that. Now, another different namespace that we store data in, if we look at the client SDK, go ahead and open that up. And then within the CCM application class, so if we open that up and we look at the application deployment ID. So this is going to be, this namespace controls different information that the user might see. So data that would show up in Software Center, we're going to get data about that here. So for example, we're going to give you the full name of the application, different actions. So whether it's only allowed to be installed, if you enable the uninstall feature or the repair, you would also get more information available here. We're going to show whether it's currently installed, as well as the progress. So if we were to click install in Software Center, we would see this WMI namespace and these different properties and attributes automatically update. We can also see that it's set to notify the user. So that's why we got that notification in our sys tray. We'll see information about the version, and I think that's probably what's kind of relevant here within WMI, at least for what we need to see here. So that looks good. So going back through the log, so this is really just the beginning of what started happening here. So once we start downloading policy, the next thing that's going to kick in is to actually see whether the application is needed. So once we get the policy and the basics about the information, it's then going to start evaluating whether the application is required for any of the deployment types. So let's just walk through the log. A lot of these lines are going to be related to downloading the initial policy. So all those different requirements and the rules that we created, they all need to be evaluated and downloaded. So we'll keep on kind of scrolling down. What we're going to be looking for is the DCM Agent component within this log file. So that's going to be, once we actually get everything downloaded and we get all the policy, that's going to be the component that's actually going to start evaluating the requirements to see if it's actually needed. All right, so I went ahead and found the first message from the DCM agent. So this is going to be high-level information about the evaluation of the application. So if we look over here, we can see information that it's going to start seeing whether or not it needs this assignment for the application deployment. So that's going to go ahead and kick in, and then it's going to start evaluating different things within that application. So we can see that the component, it sees that the application is targeted to the machine. So then it's going to go ahead and start downloading a little bit more. And let me just run another quick search to find the next DCM agent log. So here we go. So it can see that the scan is happening here. It can tell that it's not a mandatory application deployment, but it's going to give us some basic information about how it's evaluating. CI agent's then going to kick in. So this is going to start doing a deeper level evaluation. So we're going to start seeing information from the configuration item agent where it's going to start evaluating whether or not it's required. Right. So next, we're going to get a lot of different configuration item data starting to download from our management point. So here we can see data transfer service is starting to download just different data within this application. So when I refer to a configuration item, that's really just an application. So on the back end, an application is stored as a configuration item, the same way that updates are also configuration items. So that's going to be us downloading all the different data for the configuration item within that application. So let me just run a quick search to see the next line that I'm looking at. So the CI agent, we're going to see information that the deployment is applicable and it's in scope for being evaluated. So the base requirements within our requirements are met. So then it's going to continue evaluating additional requirements to see whether or not any of the deployment types within that application are applicable. So here, for example, we can see it evaluating some of the different requirements for the client OSs that we did for those different deployment types. So the next action, once it's kind of done evaluating all of those, there's going to be a app intent eval log that we're going to look at here. Now this is going to give us some detailed stats about whether any of the application's dependencies or deployment types are within scope for being needed on this device. So here we can see that the deployment type, so here we can see the application, we can see the MSI, and then what we're going to do is we can see it has two different IDs here. So that's our two different deployment types. Now, what we're going to also see that it's going to start evaluating each of those deployment types. So after the CI agent evaluated all the different requirements, the app intent eval is going to tell us whether anything's actually needed on that device for that. So if we take a look at this log file for app intent eval, we can see, hey, this deployment for this application, the current state is not installed. The applicability is applicable, so that looks good. Now the resolved state is available, so that means that it's an available deployment, so this would never automatically install or reevaluate like if it was a required deployment. So we can see the configuration state, it doesn't need to remediate or install this because it's just available, so it's not going to automatically force anything. For the title, we can see that this is the 64-bit MSI deployment type that we're detecting as applicable and available to install. Now, if we look at the next line, we can see that this is evaluating the deployment type for the 32-bit version. Since this is a 64-bit OS, we can verify that the applicability for this deployment type is reporting back as not being applicable. So now that we've determined that the 64-bit deployment type is applicable, the next line that I'm going to search for is the CCM SDK Provider. So this is going to be a log file that's going to determine whether or not we actually need to display anything to the users and notify anybody about this deployment. So we can see that this provider is going to be what reports back that this application is needed, and then that's going to determine whether we need to display any messages. So for example, this was available and it was set to show notifications. So since a user was logged in, that's why we got the notification. So some of these components are going to be what's actually going to be sending that notification in. So once that reports that the application is needed and it needs to determine whether it's there, the next log file that we're going to do is show you the actual notification here. So if we search out, we can see that there's a component called SCC client. So this is going to be the actual component that's going to report and interactively show things to Software Center and or any logged in user, depending on the way that your application is set to deploy. Okay, search here. So here's that same component. So this is where we can actually see that namespace that we were looking at in WMI for that client SDK. This is that same namespace and property that we were looking at within WMI Explorer over here. So this is going to be what's being reported into Software Center and determining whether we're showing any user notifications like pop-ups, or whether it's going to be even displayed in Software Center if the user was to manually open up Software Center. So that looks good. Now, since we showed the notification, let me just run a quick search here. We can see a component called SC Toast Notifications is going to automatically prompt the actual balloon notification that we saw here in the notification center. So that's going to be where we can see that it starts to trigger that, and then it's going to show that notification here. All right, so that's pretty much where we're at right now. So the next thing that we're going to go ahead and look at is what actually happens when an installation is triggered and what other components are involved. So what we'll do, we'll go ahead and open up Software Center. There we go. All right, so I just want to take a note where we're at in a log file so we can ignore anything before this. So it looks like 1049.18. All right, so we're going to go ahead and trigger a install from Software Center. So this should be pretty quick since it's just a small MSI. So there we can go. We can see that the installation is now completed. So what I'll do, I'll go ahead and minimize this, and we will open up our log files again. And just because there might be some new log files that weren't previously there, I'm going to go ahead and select everything again and then choose to merge and then open. All right, so now that the log files have loaded, we're back to where we previously left off. So I've already scrolled down to my 1049.18 mark. So what we can see here is the first thing that's going to kick in is our SCC client. So this is going to show us, hey, an installation is now being performed. The reason we're seeing this from SCC client is because I triggered the installation from Software Center, and that's going to be what triggered the install to actually initiate here. So here we go. Right after we started triggering that, that's going to tell the DCM agent to start evaluating whether the application is still needed. So if we take a look at that log file line, we can see that the deployment for the application is now starting to install, or it's starting to evaluate. So we can see that it's set to be a machine targeted deployment, and it's going to start evaluating and installing. Now, the next relevant log is going to be app discovery. So if I do a quick search for the log line that I'm looking at, what we're going to see is it's going to start performing the detection of the deployment type. So we can see that it's going to evaluate whether that 64-bit deployment type for the MSI is still applicable to my device. So I can see that information here. And then we can see, if we look back here, scroll down, and we can see that it detected that the MSI is not discovered, or whatever requirements that you had within there for our install rule. We can see that it's not installed currently. So that looks good. So that's going to mean that that deployment type is now needed, and it's going to start triggering the next action here. So once that's determined it's needed, it's going to then do a content lookup for the application. So if I search for my next relevant line, we can see that the CAS log, or content access, is then going to determine that it has content that it needs to download. So if we take a quick look here, we can see that the content that it's determined that it needed is this content ID. Now, if we go ahead and copy that and look back in our console, If we take a look at the deployment type and the content ID, we can see that the ID that we copied here is going to correlate to the 64-bit only deployment type, because we wouldn't need to download anything for this 32-bit version because we determined that that content and that deployment type is not applicable for our device. So searching back, we can just verify in that log file that we're downloading the content that ends in 429. So jumping back over here, we can see that we're downloading 429 and the revision is just version 1. So if you had any modifications to that content and chose to update the DP, you might see like a .2 or .3 or whatever revision number that we're on. So once we determine the content that we actually need, the next line that I'm going to look at here is going to be our content transfer manager is actually going to start a download operation for bits. So we're going to see that that's going to kick in and say, hey, I need to download some content, and that's going to initiate a session for bits that's actually going to perform the download. So once we're ready to download the content, the next component that comes into play is location services. So that's going to be when our client sends a request to our management point to determine, is this content available on any of our distribution points? So here we can see that location services is creating a request to determine whether or not this content is available here. All right, so then we can see that it's waiting for locations to reply. So just keep scrolling down here. We'll wait till we see the distribution points that respond back whether there's any available here. Within this, we can also see that the client SDK as well as Software Center client, some of these are getting updated. So for example, this would be changing the state to be in the downloading state once we're in this phase instead of installing. So before we get to installing, it would show downloading here because this is where it's actually looking for the content. So here we go. So back to the CAS log. Once location services request that, we can see that it's going to give us information about whether it found anything, right? So we can see that it found the distribution points, and then that's going to return back to the CAS log, and then we can see that it found the distribution point, and this is the first, so 0 means the first one found. So depending on how your boundaries are set up, you could have multiple hits, and then it might determine it based on whether there's any in the same subnet or other different priorities that you might have within your boundary groups. But what we can see here, we did determine that this content that we requested within this boundary that we're on is also in the local subnet here. So that would be preferred if you had multiple DPs with this and your client was in multiple boundaries for those DPs. So this will give us the path of where that content is essentially being hosted on our distribution point. So that's the actual path that we would be using when we start requesting this download. So once we have that location sent back, the next thing is going to be the actual downloading of the content. So if we run a quick look here, that's going to actually hand off the download to the data transfer service. Let me see if I can search out and find this really quick. All right, so here we go. So now we can see the data transfer service. It's got the URL passed to it from the CAS component. And now this is going to be what's actually performing the download of the actual content. So here we can see that it's starting the download. And then we can see data transfer service starting to download all the information about that. Now, one thing to note is that we could actually see how this looks from where our client's downloading this. So if I come in here and copy this path, we could actually open up a web browser here. Now, since I am requiring authentication, we will get prompted most likely for a username here. There we go. And I'm just going to enter my credentials, but here we can actually see the MSI being hosted on our DP. So this is basically what the data transfer service would be initiating to actually download the content. So once the download is complete, what we'll do is the CAS log is going to report back where that actually got downloaded. So we can see that the download was complete, and it also verified the hash file the CAS component did. And then it's also going to tell us where it is in our cache folder. So for example, if I copy this path and actually look at this folder, this is going to contain our MSI file that was in our source for our deployment type. So that looks good. So now that's in the cache, the next thing that we're really interested in is the actual installation of the MSI file, or really whatever, depending on your application, whatever your installation command would be. So we can see a lot of different things going on here. So we're notifying things back to Software Center. So at that point, it would probably be the download complete, and then it would update Software Center to show installing at this phase. But the component that we're interested in next is going to be the AppEnforce component. So let me just do a quick search to see if I can jump here faster. So here we go. So the AppEnforce is then going to verify one last time that that deployment type is still needed. And then it's going to go ahead and start doing the installation. So if I go ahead, looks like we have some other logs that kind of kicked in before the next log file here. So looking back to the next log for the AppEnforce, we can see that the MSI for that deployment type was not currently installed. So now we're going to actually get information about what do we do to actually install this deployment type. So if I look at this log line, it's going to give us information about the command line, whether or not the installation command is allowing the user to interact, information about where we're installing it from, and then that's going to actually trigger the installation. So if we look at the next line here in AppEnforce, we can see that it started the command line to actually perform the installation here. So that looks good. So while that was installing, we have some other components just kind of over here reporting different things back. But here's the AppEnforce. We can see that it is installing. Just run a quick search because I know how that's going to exit. So here is the last line here in AppEnforce. So we can see that it was executing and then it completed with exit code 0. So that means it was successful, and then we would report that back. So once AppEnforce is done installing, it's going to verify that the MSI, or the detection method for that deployment type, is now compliant. So we can see that it discovered that, hey, this is now installed. So once that's done, there's going to be a lot of different components coming into play. So the SDK is going to come into play. It's then going to also start sending different messages back to our SCC client. So we would see in Software Center, this would start showing back as installed. So there's going to be quite a bit going on here in the background. So that's looking just different reporting, and the CI is evaluating and things getting reported back using state messages. So things get reported back to our management point that, hey, this application state is now installed. So if we look back in WMI and we look back at our client SDK and our application, we can now see that the application is showing as not needed. So now that it's installed, that's going to show as compliant. So what I had to do is go ahead and refresh this object. So now we can see that if we look at our allowed actions, instead of just having install, we now have uninstall as well. And now we can see that the install state is now showing installed for this application. One item that I did want to show you over here is the application policy. I meant to pull this up earlier, but this should still show us all the data. So the deployment types and the application data, a lot of the information about the evaluation, the requirements of each deployment type is going to be stored in this CCM application policy, and then the instance for the application ID here. So one interesting thing, if we copy the deployment report, and let me just bring that over from a different window that I pasted that into, this is going to give us all the metadata and the XML about our configuration item or our application. So for example, we can see this is our application for 7-zip. We can see all the information about the requirements for that. So here's our name of the application, and we can also see each different deployment type. So here's the deployment type for the 32-bit MSI. So if I look at that, it's going to give us all the requirement options that we created here. So all those 32-bit OSs. This is going to be the actual logic that the client's going to be using for evaluating those different compliance rules as well. So scrolling down, we can also see, hey, this is the 64-bit MSI, and this is going to be the data that the client's going to read from WMI when it's actually evaluating that. So all those different CI agent logs and the things that we're evaluating in the background, it's going to be pulling the application configuration items and the deployment type data from WMI after the policy gets downloaded and then saved in the WMI. So I thought this was a pretty interesting class and property for actually where it stores information that we're evaluating about these. All right, so I think that's all I had. I know this is a pretty complex topic. There are a lot of different components and log files that were involved with the way that applications get evaluated and installed on the client side. I will include resources within the accompanying blog post, so be sure to check that out. I try to list everything that I was looking at, all the relevant components and log files that take place during the application evaluation, download, and installation. I hope this video was helpful, and thank you for watching.